Hey, I'm Leila. Welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much guys for liking my videos and writing all those wonderful comments. I always look forward to reading them after I post every video. In this tutorial we will cover watercolor effects. So we will look at things like different kind of materials, those little things that can make a lot of difference to your art, and they're not very hard to implement as well. It's just knowing what to do, when, and how long to wait for things to dry. So let's go. If you are after a really cool, strange texture, then what you want to do is you want to create your background colors. So I'm just using different things, nothing really specific. Amount of moisture that you have on your paper is crucial. If it's really dry, it won't work. If it's wet, it will take ages and ages for it to dry. I'm just removing the extra moisture from the masking tape. And then what you want to do, grab some clean film and lay it on. Now you want to crinkle it up. It's up to you how much you crinkle it up. And you leave it to dry. Now of course, because you have covered it up, it's going to take ages to dry, but you will get this really cool texture once you remove it. Perfect for any kind of a backdrop where you want a specific texture somewhere, but not too specific where you're not going into detail, say for example on the background, and then you can add other things. So let's have a look what happens when this dries. So when this is dry, you can remove the cling film and you will get this kind of a texture. So again, can be quite useful or not, depending on your type of work and depending on the specific project that you would be working on. So let's have a look at what salt can do to our painting. Now let's see how you can use a material that anyone can find in their home, and that's salt. Now for this trick you sort of have to really be very careful about how much water you have on. If you have too much, you will have a mess and the salt can stick to your paper. If you have your paint surface that is too dry, again, nothing's going to happen. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that it's sort of somewhere in between. Just adding a darker, maybe a bit of purple. Okay, so what you don't want to do is you don't want to have water pooling. So if you have a little pool, like this is what's happening here. So what you can do is you can get a bit of tissue paper, just absorb all that extra moisture that you've got. Okay, so now I quite like this sort of a bluey transitioning color. So now let's start with the regular table salt. So what you want to do is you just want to apply it. Just like this. And then let's also try a little bit of sea salt, which is a little bit coarser. Now this is where you want to leave everything and you don't want to add any more water or any more paint or anything like this. Now you can't do anything with it. It's very, very important. Don't do anything with it until it's completely dry, so there's no more moisture on it. Can you see how this is already starting to work? Another thing about this technique is that it's absolutely unpredictable. you can put it on and then do the same sort of a situation, but things can turn out very, very differently. And the reason for that is that not only does it depend on the type of paper you use, how much moisture there was when you applied it, but also how much humidity there is in the air as well. And as I said, every time you would apply this, you will get a very different result. But that's the cool sort of a thing about it, you know. It's you don't know exactly what to expect. This is really awesome. Just this all appearing now as I'm talking. So I will leave this to dry and get back to you when it's all done. So now it's been quite a bit of time. You do have to remember that when you do this technique, it will take for the watercolor paint to dry a bit longer than it would just because of the salt situation. So what you want to do next is you want to use your hand, or you can use a dry brush as well to do this. But you can just remove the salt and pretty much brush it off. And you can see what it looks like now. Every time you would try it, you would get a different variation. Like this time around, I got less of the texture with the larger salt and more of the texture with the with the table salt. But sometimes it works the other way around, and you can get really large sort of a flowing areas with the rock salt. Now, if you would like to see how I turned this into this, you can check out my Patreon page, where just for $8 a month you get to see all the extra videos. Whenever you've been using watercolor, have you ever wondered how you can reserve specific spots and just leave them plain paper? Well, there are lots of other tricks, and let's have a look how we can achieve that in the quickest, most cost-effective way. Now, let's have a look at another technique that can be used in some artworks, and that's creating a surface for your water to run off. You can use something like white crayon. So this is a white crayon. You just need to make sure that it's not a soft type, it's a very oily one, very waxy. Or you can also use candle wax. I will explain when the two things are better used. So for example, because this already has the white color, so if I do a little thing here, see, it leaves the white residue. So if I'm wanting to create white, then something like this would go really well. But if I'm working on the colored paper, what would be much better to use is to use transparent wax, you know, from your just really standard little candles. They don't leave as much of a white residue. So it's up to you what you want to create. So for example, you can use it with something very simple, very abstract, very, you know, very playful. So you apply something like that on, then you add the paint, and the paint runs off the paper. So something like that can be really good for situations where you don't need to apply any more paint on top, because even if you try to apply any other color, so if you apply any other color, the same thing would happen. Now, what you can use this for is, for example, if you are working on a landscape and you're working on the seascape and you are creating, you know, little waves or something like that, then this can be used really well for that as well, to create little, you know, to reserve these little spots. And again, important thing, make sure that this is very waxy. Cheaper crayons actually have better quality for resisting water rather than your artist grade pastels. Or, as I said before, you can use a piece of the wax from the candle instead of this, because you can see how whereas, for example, on a specific color this will leave the white mark, and this will not leave the white mark, but will work in the same way to make your paint run off. So for example, if now I want to create another color there, both of them would work just fine, but the white crayon has deposited white, whereas the candle wax did not deposit any color. So that's just something to keep in mind. And another very important thing to remember with this technique is that this is very, very affordable. There's another technique in this video, and that's using masking fluid, but it's much more expensive, whereas something like this you can just pick it up from like a $2 shop or something, and it will last you for a long time. Now let's talk about another very important addition to your watercolor, and that is masking fluid. If you watch any other watercolor videos, this is probably something that you have heard about, because it's specifically made for this sort of a thing, you know, like all the other tricks like using crayons and other things. It's just a little bit of the DIY, and some of them turn out to be very cheap and very cool. But what I would suggest here, if you want to get seriously into your watercolor painting, then probably using something like this can be a good thing. Okay, so what do? You pretty much have something sketched on, for example, right? I don't know, your apples, cherries, whatever it is, and say you've got your highlight that you want to reserve, but because you want to use so much fluid paint, it will be really hard to leave this alone. So what you'd want to do with something like this is to use a dry brush, go in there, cover a specific area, right? You might want to create all sorts of things, so I will, just for the sake of it, I don't know, do different sort of spots, and maybe we can do something there. You know, just different things for you to try out. Now, while it is wet, you can wash it off with water, but I suggest to wash it off with water and then wash your brush with some soap as well, just because this is a latex sort of a based solution most commonly. So you know, and if you are using the paint brush that you would use for your painting, then it's a good idea to wash it. Now, while this is drying, I will tell you that you can get these materials in, see, this is like a bottle, so you can cover areas as large or as small as you'd like, but you can also get this stuff in pens. You can get it in these little sort of like, you know, in the old days we used to get twink, that sort of a setup. So have a look, because everyone has their own needs and their own skill set and their own artworks that they work on. So what you want to do is you want to wait for this to dry, and then when it's dry, you can start applying your watercolor paint. I'm going to apply my paint, whatever random colors I want this to be. And I might want to use a lot of water or little water. It depends, you know, already up to you what it is that you're trying to create. I'm just being very free-flowing. Now I'll take a smaller brush, and perhaps I want to create, you know, things where there's a lot of running in the water. Maybe I'm using splatting and, you know, dripping and all sorts of stuff. You can see how with something like this, it will be quite hard to just reserve these areas and just leave them as they are. Okay, so now that this is drying, I'm actually going to add more layers onto this, just to show you. So for example, you can, you know, you can keep working, keep adding things, keep building things up, and until you remove this, it's not going to go away. It's just going to be there, so it doesn't matter what I do. It's just going to stay there. Okay, now that this artwork is dry, well, this is not an artwork, but you can imagine if you're doing this on artwork, what you need to do is you need to very carefully remove that masking fluid, and see, it comes off. You can scrape it off with a finger or with your nail, and it creates, you know, these white sort of specks, white spots in the paper. You can remove it even just by rubbing your finger through, but I think the paper is somewhat damp still, so I don't want to ruin the paper. So you can see how it comes off really easily just by you know, using your fingernail. And so after this film is gone, because you've got nice clean paper, you can apply any other color on top of it. So just make sure that you give it a really good rub, and it'll completely come off. So see, it comes off in these little. So there you go. So all of these reserved areas, they're all just clean paper now. And if you want to add anything else, so for example, if I've reserved this for a brighter color, then I can, you know, paint anything I want on this here. So yeah, it's quite an interesting product to use, can be very helpful, but the downside of this is that you do need to go to an art shop to get it, and different brands of course cost different amount, but it is generally a more of an expensive product than, say, for example, using a crayon or something like that. Now let's have a look at another technique, and that's using materials like just these random materials like tissue paper or like sponges to create textures. Now there are two different ways you can do that. Way number one, and that's applying a specific color. You know, you're painting along, you know, using your different shades, and then you decide that you want more texture. So what can you do? You can take a sponge and create textures, so absorbing things. You can even have sponges that are cut out, or those sea sponges as well. I don't have one unfortunately at the moment, so can't show you. You can also use your tissue paper by, you know, doing this, and you can create all these different I'll just lift it up like that, all of these different textures that you might like to create. Also working with things like a really wet paint or semi-dry paint will also give you a very different result as well. Now let's have a look at what you can do when you are depositing paint. So you can actually use your sponge to deposit the paint. Now you can do what I'm doing here, or you can have like a little plate or a palette perhaps even, and use that. Now depending on how damp your sponges and how damp your paint is would give you different results again. So a lot of it is experimenting, and a lot of it is, you know, creating different. See, the more I press, you get the change, variation in color here as well. But this can be something. So for example, this is still damp here, so if I do this on the damp area, it will run a little bit more, and if I'm doing it on something dry, of course it's got nowhere to run. So another thing to think about, again, if you want something very strong and very defined, you know, that's all in your hands. You cut things, shape things to your liking. Now I have another really interesting texture you can create with a material that is usually readily available. Now the cool thing about paper towels is that they come in different patterns as well, so you can already use something that's been designed. So for example, I can see this one has all these circles that are going round and round, and then this one's got sort of a almost like a weaved type of a pattern. So let's have a look how you can achieve beautiful texture just using this simple material that is, again, very cheap, available pretty much everywhere. So for that, what I would suggest is you dampen your paper, and you apply whatever colors that you are after. So I'm just going to do a mixture of things. Now for something like this, you do want your colors to be somewhat prominent. You don't want them to be too pale because it won't show as well. But then again, it depends mainly on your project, you know, what sort of a thing you are going after. Now we're getting this beautiful bleed in here. And let's make it a full rainbow and actually add some purple in there. Okay, so now after you've chosen your pattern that you like the best, you can just apply this and press it on. It's as simple as that. You can leave that to dry a little bit, but you don't, usually this doesn't take much time, and the reason is that the paper towel is quite absorbent, so it absorbs most of the moisture. So then when you remove this, you've got this beautiful texture that can be used as a background. You pretty much have used this as a stencil in a way. And as I said, you can get all these different patterns and all these different textures and things like that. Now if you are into more of the crafty side of things or something abstract, you can always even cut pieces of it, so cut different shapes and press those, and the possibilities are endless really. So it really is up to you how far you want to go with this. Now if you would like to know what this can do for your watercolor painting, make sure to check out my Patreon page. I already have a video that tells you what alcohol can do for your watercolor textures. Remember, for just $8 a month, you will get access to all the extra videos that are not available here on YouTube. Okay, now let's have a look at this other style of creating textures. And that's a very common one, but not used as often as I think it could be. And that's splatters and drips. Now, when you are working with watercolor, there are some situations where you might to create a scene or a texture or anything like this, where you can just spray your paint on like this. So brushes like this would work much better for it. Watercolor brushes won't be as successful in this, just because their bristles are too soft. So you want something with harder bristle would work much better. So you'd want to use like an old brush or like an acrylic brush, I mean for acrylic paint. Another thing you can use is a toothbrush. Now this is a special toothbrush that I keep in my studio only for using with paint, so no one's brushing their teeth with this. I do suggest that you do keep a separate one, otherwise you don't know what you're going to get, orange teeth or green or something like that. Okay, so what you want to do again is that you'd want to load it up with the paint and with water. See, I'm doing it here with just my brush. You can do it on your palette if you've got quite a bit of water, and you can get a very similar result as well. So just by flicking it, you can create a really nice sort of a splashing effect. Now one more thing to remember is that the closer you hold your brush, toothbrush or paintbrush, to the paper when you're doing this, the more of this effect you're going to get. The further away you hold it, the more of just little drips you are going to get. So this is for spray, right? So now let's have a look at dripping paint. And dripping paint, kind of like what's happened there involuntarily, is when you can grab one of your watercolor brushes as normal. You would load it up and then you can just on your paintbrush and you get much larger splatters. So that can be a really cool effect as well. And remember, you can use this technique not just with watercolor paint. You can use it with acrylics, you can use it on different color paper. So for example, on black, if you're using this as white, it can look like stars, like reflections. So this technique is really cool because it's so versatile. And another thing as well is that you can always make things run and make things drip. So you see how all of these little spots that have quite a bit of paint on them, if I do this and I kind of, you know, they sort of start to run and to drip. You do want something with quite a bit of water for that to happen. Now let's talk about another technique, and that's scraping. Okay, and there are two different types of scraping. There is one type of scraping that I covered in my previous video, where you can use any kind of dry paint, and you can just pick a little bit of that paper away to remove the top layer that contains paint, and then you've got your white spot, you know, which is perfect for little highlights or maybe some little mistakes that you've made. But there's also another type of scraping, and that type of scraping is when you scrape your paper before you apply paint. Now this is to create a different kind of texture. This kind of texture is perfect for when you're working on, for example, tree bark or any kind of textures. So if you scrape your paper, and especially it's better if you use a thick paper, if this is your actual work. For these little things I'm just using whatever offcuts I've got, but if you are creating your artwork and you think you're going to be scraping there, make sure that you use nice thick, minimum 300 grams paper, maybe even thicker. So two ways. So see, I did some scraping on the dry paper and then applied paint, and now you can create different kind of texture by scraping paper while it's still wet and it has a color on it. So this is much more precise. It's a little bit easier. See, if you're scratching the dry paper, you get more of the texture, but you've got less control over it. With this paper, I can pretty much scrape any pattern I want. So I can do this pretty much like drawing. The only difference is that when you are drawing or doing anything else, the surface stays flat. With this, you are creating texture. So if you are applying any other color on top of that, that area is going to absorb that same color, and it's going to morph into the color that you are applying. You see, it can be useful if you're trying to get that kind of effect going, or if you want to make a really permanent mark. I personally don't use this technique very often, and usually the reason is that I just don't have a scraper around, you know, I don't carry it around with me, say when I'm sketching something outdoors. But if you are into creating textures, it can be really useful, you know, just another little technique to have in your arsenal of knowledge. You can see how a lot of these techniques can be used not just with watercolor but with other media as well, and also you can mix them and match them, and that's how I think you can get the most beautiful results out of this. So for example, if you combine this technique with this and with this, then you can create these really beautiful artworks. So remember, these are just little basic things that I showed you, and you can always you know, you can always experiment and create more of the interesting effects, create very original artworks using all of these techniques. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you will be employing all of these effects that we worked over. At least try them out. I'm sure that some of them will become your favorites. So as always, don't forget to subscribe, press the notification bell, give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and thank you very much for painting with me. I hope you guys have a great day. See you soon!